I grew up in the quiet countryside. It was beautiful. Life definitely moved a little slower there, but that didn't mean we didn't have our fair share of trouble. Like, there was this house in town everyone avoided. As kids, we'd dare each other to go up to it, but none of us were ever brave enough. An old woman named Pearl lived there, but us kids just called her the crazy old lady. Every Halloween she'd shout from her window, "Stay away from my house, you rotten kids!" We just assumed she was crazy or possessed. One day we were carving pumpkins, and my sister and I made a joke about Pearl being possessed in front of my mom. My mom's face and tone changed immediately. "So everyone says she's possessed? Is that the story going around?" I was shocked and worried I'd done something wrong. It was rude to call adults crazy. It's something I'd get in trouble for. "Yeah, but it's just a joke." "That's not funny," my mom replied. "She's not possessed. Years ago, when I was a little girl, there were these creepy kids who appeared one October and began knocking on doors late at night. They weren't like us. They dressed weird, like they were adults, but their clothes didn't fit exactly right. When they walked, their movement was so calm, it was almost like they were floating, and their eyes were completely black, no white at all. They'd go up to someone's house and ask to come inside, or to get a ride somewhere, or to use the phone, or something. Rumors spread that Old Man Joe let them in. He became really sick and died within a few days. After that, everyone in town knew, never let them in. Because it was already pretty late in October, and because of what happened, the adults in town decided the safest thing to do would be to cancel Halloween. It was a huge disappointment for everyone, especially Pearl. She didn't have any children of her own, and looked forward to seeing the children dressed up and playing outside in costume. That Halloween night she was on the phone, gossiping with her neighbor, when there was a knock. A friend asked who it was. Pearl answered her, but her words were slowed. "Oh, it's just a couple of kids." "Don't answer the door," her friend shouted back. But it was no use. Pearl approached the door. "Who's there?" But there was no answer, just more eerie knocks. Her friend, realizing the danger, frantically ran out of her house, jumped into her car, and honked her horn loudly like a crazy person. Glancing over, she saw the children standing on Pearl's porch. In sync, they turned to face her. The blaring horn seemed to distract them, loosening whatever grip they had on Pearl, giving her just enough time to retreat back inside and slam the door shut. But Pearl was never the same after that. She didn't get sick, but something else happened. Now every Halloween she guards her house from the children with the black eyes. I've always trusted Max's instincts. He's been a good dog ever since he was a pup, loyal and friendly. But something happened one night that still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. It was around midnight, and I was wrapped up in a book when Max started growling, low and ominous. He was staring intently at the old rocking chair we had in my bedroom. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine, telling myself he was probably growling at a moth or some insect I couldn't see. But the growl grew louder, more desperate, as if Max was seeing something truly terrifying. Finally, I put down my book and glanced over. The rocking chair looked like it was moving. I told Max to hush, and in the silence I could hear it. Between Max's whimpers, the rocking chair was creeping. My heart raced as I looked back at Max, who upon seeing the fear in my eyes began barking wildly, with his eyes fixed on the chair. I was so scared I didn't want to move. Taking a deep breath, I slowly reached for the lamp on my nightstand, but never took my eyes off the chair in the dark. I was hoping maybe the light would make whatever it was stop. My hand touched the switch, and with a click, light momentarily spilled into the room before going out completely, plunging the room back into darkness. The bulb must have burnt out or something, but I was done investigating. In the split second the light was on, I saw a hand rocking the chair from behind. I ran out of there with Max close behind and got my mom. My mother was not happy. She tried to give me the usual, "It was just a nightmare, go back to sleep." But I insisted she come to my room. When she got there, the rocking chair was still. I refused to even walk past the doorway until I saw Max. Max managed to calmly walk right in, lay on the ground by my bed, and fall right to sleep without a problem. My mother let out a, "See? Just a bad dream," and went back to her room. The idea of it being a bad dream was comforting, but when I got back to my bed, I realized I couldn't have been dreaming, because I wasn't asleep. I was sitting up reading. Ever since I was a child, I've been terrified of rats. It's a fear I've never quite outgrown. So when Timothy, my 6-year-old, proudly showed me his newest drawing, an eerie depiction of a rat, I struggled to contain my unease. "That's a nice drawing, Timmy," I said, forcing a smile. "What made you think to draw this?" "He told me to draw him," Timmy responded, pointing to the eerie rat he'd sketched. I furrowed my brow. I was confused. "Who told you?" "The rat," Timmy said simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The picture was upsetting to me. It was probably the fault of Mickey Mouse or some other pro-mouse propaganda on TV. I shook off the uneasy feeling, and when Timmy wasn't looking, quietly put his drawing in the trash. But that night, I heard a soft scratching sound. I held my breath, listening intently. The unmistakable sound of tiny claws skittering across the floor reached my ears. Something was wrong. I have a cat. Hell, much like ancient Egyptians, my cat was a god that protected me from rats. I thought to myself, maybe Tiger got himself caught on something under the sofa and was stuck. Now he's scratching at the ground trying to break free. So I grabbed my cell phone and opened my room door. He dashed right inside. Strange, but at least I know where the scratching sound was coming from. So I thought. Before I could get back to bed, I again heard the scratching noise coming from outside of my room. It couldn't be Tiger. Again arming myself with my cell phone's flashlight, I peeked into the hallway. Down the hall, the dim beam caught the glint of a pair of beady eyes. A rat. I was paralyzed in fear, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel it everywhere. My head, my hands, my feet. Everywhere. The rat just stood there, looking back at me. The longer we stood there with locked eyes, the more my eyes adjusted to the dark. This was no ordinary rat. It looked like the rat from Timmy's picture. I was so confused, covered in sweat and hands shaking. I slowly got out of my room and began to approach whatever this was. As I did, it ran off. I can't prove it, but I swear that rat came from Timmy's drawing.
If you enjoyed this, please make sure you tell us in the comments. Feel free to email us your stories if you'd like to see them here. And if you want to show us a little love, check us out on Patreon. It's patreon.com/superhorrorshow.
I always loved visiting Grandma's house, with its tall ceilings. I don't know what it's called, but you could see the first floor from the second floor by looking over a banister. I used to throw my toys over, mostly teddy bears and other stuffed toys. But when no one was looking, I'd toss a G.I. Joe or two. Anyways, the one thing I did not like about this setup was the guest bedroom on the second floor. It sat in the center of the hall. It wasn't the room itself, but rather its sole occupant. a porcelain clown doll that my grandma said used to belong to my great-grandmother. The doll was perched on a chair, dressed in red and yellows. It was somewhat faded, but being so old, it seemed about right. It had a painted smile that stretched far too wide on its face. I was told to never touch it. For me, that wasn't a problem. I didn't want to. Let's be real. As a kid, I would say a doll is a girl's toy, but I'm old enough to admit it now. That thing scared the crap out of me. One night, my mom and grandma were talking downstairs. I got bored, but had gotten into trouble for throwing some G.I. Joes off the second floor earlier that day. So, I decided I'd explore the guest room. The clown doll was in it, and it was creepy, but I turned the light on and started looking around the room anyways. There was nothing interesting in there for a kid. Before leaving, I mockingly said, "You're not so scary," trying to sound as tough as a 7-year-old could. Suddenly, to my horror, the doll's eyes gave a slow, deliberate wink. I froze and stopped breathing. My eyes were locked on the clown. The room's temperature seemed to drop. I felt cold, icy even, but I was sweating. All at once, I must have gotten the power to move again, because I ran out of that room and slammed the door as fast as I could. My mom and grandmother came rushing over. Between the door slamming and me running down the stairs, they knew something was up. My mom noticed I was sweating and put her hands on my forehead to check me for a fever. She wanted to know what happened. I told her the clown winked at me. My grandmother very matter-of-factly told me that wasn't possible. The doll was made of porcelain. I must have imagined it. My mom did one of those classic, "It's getting late, we need to get home, he needs to go to bed." And we left. On the car ride home, my mom looked at me thoughtfully and said, "You know, when I was a kid, I thought I saw it move once too." But dolls can't wink. It's just our imaginations helping reinforce Grandma's rule to stay away from it. It's an antique. My mom's words comforted me that night in the car because it meant that we were like each other. We experienced similar things. But now as an adult, I can't help but wonder, us both seeing the same thing years apart, doesn't that increase the likelihood of it being real?
On a chilly November night in 1966, a group of 5 men were digging a grave in a cemetery near Clendon, West Virginia. What they experienced that fateful evening would haunt them for the rest of their lives. As they toiled amongst the tombstones, their eyes widened in fear and shivers were sent down their spines. Emerging from the looming trees that bordered the cemetery, a creature with huge dark wings, like those of a giant moth, flew over them. At first, thinking that it was a huge bird, the men watched and realized this thing was no ordinary bird. It was a winged humanoid creature that would later be known as the Mothman. The creature's presence loomed ominously over West Virginia and its neighboring states. Sightings emerged near the forsaken grounds of the West Virginia Ordnance Works, a place the locals called the TNT area. Nestled to the north of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, this area was once a bustling munitions depot, back in the grim days of World War II. There they manufactured the tools of destruction, ammunition, and dynamite. In the desolate heart of the TNT area, on November 15, 1966, just 3 days after the initial sighting, an eerie encounter awaited 2 young couples. Roger and Linda Scarberry, accompanied by Steve and Mary Mollett, driving through the midnight shroud in Roger's '57 Chevy Bel Air, Linda was the first to bear witness to the creature. Her eyes locked onto a pair of crimson orbs, piercing the darkness beside the long-forgotten North Power Plant. Her scream shattered the eerie silence. Amidst the shadows stood a terrifying figure, something human-like but terribly otherworldly. It loomed at a towering 7 feet, its monstrous wings tightly folded against its back. The creature unfolded its nightmarish wings, and with wings outstretched, It pursued them at mind-bending speeds down Highway 62, exceeding 100 miles per hour. The four, shaken and bewildered, arrived in Point Pleasant. Roger parked his Chevy on the town's edge, where they discussed their encounter. They figured it must have been a huge bird, but unsure, curiosity drove them back to the TNT area. Once back, they spotted the creature, lurking ominously along Route 62. The truth was undeniable. This creature was no bird. In the car's piercing headlights, the creature defied gravity, ascending vertically, vanishing into the sky. Seeking answers, they drove to the Mason County Courthouse, sharing their tale with Sheriff George Johnson and Deputy Miller Halstead. An investigation was launched, and the following day, a press conference revealed their horrifying tale, inspiring others to come forward with their own accounts. This nightmarish encounter in the TNT area marked the genesis of it all. The Point Pleasant Register's November 16th issue headline, "Couple sees man-sized bird, creature, something," launching the chilling tale into the public eye. On the morning of November 16, 1966, Linda Scarberry was rushed to the hospital by her father. The terrifying event caused her to have a nervous breakdown. Over the course of the following 13 months, this creature continued to haunt the town of Point Pleasant. There were over 100 reported sightings during this period. Witnesses to the Mothman's presence were subjected to harassment by mysterious men in black, who sought to silence any discussion of the creature. There were over 100 reported sightings during this period. These bizarre encounters all seemed to converge towards a fateful disaster, the tragic collapse of the Silver Bridge on December 15, 1967. Mary Heyer, a newspaper journalist known for her Mothman chronicles, shared a deep bond with John Keel, the author of the Mothman Prophecies. Together they embarked on a journey to seek out and document those who crossed paths with the mysterious Mothman. Mary confided in Keel about a dreadful vision that had seized her in the dead of night. In her words, she spoke of a nightmarish scene, of people drowning in the frigid water of the river, around them drifting Christmas packages. She had an eerie sensation that something terrible loomed on the horizon. Upon Keel's return to Point Pleasant, around the time of Thanksgiving 1967, he found that the region was engulfed in a disconcerting deluge of dreams and nightmares. Among those afflicted by these nocturnal omens was Virginia Thomas, haunted by visions of lives slipping away into the unforgiving waters of the nearby Ohio River. At 5:05 p.m. on the chilling eve of December 15, 1967, exactly 13 months after the Mothman's debut, the Silver Bridge was teamed with an array of vehicles. With a deafening roar, the bridge plunged into the icy depths below, claiming the lives of 46 people, leaving 9 wounded. Prior to the tragic bridge collapse, witnesses reported seeing Mothman perched ominously atop the bridge. Talk of a chilling connection between the Mothman and the disaster began to circulate, painting Mothman as a harbinger of doom or a sinister omen. After the tragedy, Mothman sightings in the area ceased. But as time went on, reports of sightings of the creature began cropping up worldwide, consistently preceding catastrophic events. This mysterious entity transcended its roots in small-town folklore, evolving into a global icon of fear and dread.
Good evening, Super Horror fam, and everyone creeping it real with us tonight. Papa Bones here, ready to rattle your skeleton with tonight's tantalizing tale. Now we all love a classic, don't we? But what if I told you we're adding a twist tonight? Oh, not just any twist, my dear ghouls. This one's got all the hair-raising, spine-chilling elements you love, with the dash of blonde. That's right, tonight our leading lady isn't just any damsel in distress, she's a blonde bombshell of horror. So grab your popcorn, and maybe a teddy bear? as we dive into the dark and eerie world of Goldilocks and the Three Werebears.
Goldie drove down the winding road, her heart fluttering in anticipation. Goldie's what her friends called her. Her real name was Chloe, but she'd been called Goldie since she was a child because of her blonde hair. She was traveling from Pennsylvania to New York, to what was supposed to be one of the biggest haunted houses in the country. The website promised acres of scares, some food vendors, and a stage that would sometimes have live entertainment. The moon turned the asphalt into a silver path, and elongated tree shadows seemed to dance along her car as she drove. She hummed a tune playing on the radio, her fingers tapping on the steering wheel. But as she ventured deeper into the dense woods, the song on the radio became garbled. She assumed it was just poor reception, but it was far worse. Immediately after the radio dying, the engine shut off, and the car coasted to a stop. Goldie picked up her phone and tried calling AAA, but she didn't have a signal. She turned off her car's lights, thinking adding a drained battery to her car's troubles would only make things worse. She got out and began circling around her car with her phone in the air, hoping for a little cell phone service. But her position didn't matter. It was a dead zone. The absence of the engine's hum made the forest stillness even more pronounced. Taking a deep breath, she scanned her surroundings. In the woods, a faint glimmer in the distance caught her eye. A house. She began walking into the woods towards it. They should have a phone, she thought to herself. Her first steps were strong. They were placed with an air of enthusiasm and confidence. But after a while, her steps felt heavy. A combination of her creeping anxiety and her realizing the house was much farther than she originally thought. From her car, it looked like there was a cozy home just a little beyond the tree line in the woods. But the more she walked, the more she realized it wasn't a simple home. It was huge. It was just far away. Luckily, the lights were on, or she never would have seen it from the road. With each step, the house seemed to get bigger. Pausing for a moment, Goldie glanced back, searching for the familiar glow of her car's reflectors. But she couldn't see them. She could get back to her car if she wanted to, but seeing the car through the brush wasn't possible, like the trees were somehow enveloping her past tracks. She felt a pit forming in her stomach as she realized if she couldn't see her car, someone on the road would not be able to see her. Then, out of the corner of her eye, in the towering trees between her and the car, Goldie noticed some shadowy figures stirring. They moved with a predatory grace, their forms shifting with the shadows, and their eyes reflecting the moonlight. Their eyes were hauntingly beautiful, until they fixated on a deer. In the blink of an eye, these two monsters jumped down from the trees and completely overwhelmed the deer. All at once, they ravenously ripped away at its flesh, as if the monsters had never eaten before. A cold rush of adrenaline surged through Goldie as she slowly backed up. The monsters were eating the deer so quickly, they'd be done in a minute, 2 minutes tops. It wasn't safe out there, and she would need to run past them to get to her car. There was no way she was going to take that risk. All at once, she broke out into a sprint, running as fast as she could towards the house in the woods. Goldie reached the house quickly, her heart pounding in her chest. At first glance, it looked like any other cottage tucked away in the woods. But as she got closer, its exaggerated features became undeniable. Every house detail was amplified. The windows were huge, stretching wider and taller than any she'd seen before. But what really caught her attention was the door. It loomed before her, a good 9 feet tall, and proportionally wide, making her feel like a small child about to enter a giant's home. A giant or not, Goldie didn't care. That deer wouldn't keep those shadowy figures busy for much longer. She quickly pulled open the gigantic door, stepped inside, and with a bit of effort managed to shut the massive door behind her. Taking no chances, she locked it, the heavy bolt thudding into place, granting her a momentary feeling of safety. Goldie tried to catch her breath. The large main hall was adorned with old portraits and grand chandeliers, their candles barely flickering. Thank God for them. If not for the candles, she wouldn't have seen the house from the road. As her gaze wandered, she was surprised by the sight of a child, locked in a cage. The child looked up, their eyes filled with a mix of hope and fear. Goldie's heart raced. Questions swirled in her mind. Who could have done this? What kind of person put the child in a cage? Was this some twisted trap for anyone unfortunate enough to venture into these woods? The size of the door, the cage, everything hinted at the possibility of someone far more formidable residing in this house. Her thoughts raced. If they would cage a child, what would they do to her? Pushing her fear down, she approached the cage cautiously, gently pressing her finger against her lips in a shh gesture. The child and her locked eyes, sharing a silent understanding. Goldie got close and whispered, "Are you okay?" The child nodded silently, "Yes." "I'm hungry." "Okay. I need to call the police, but my phone doesn't work here. Do you know if there's a phone in this house?" "Yeah, there's a phone in the kitchen," the young boy replied. "I can take you there if you need me to." And the child pointed to a key on a hook on the wall behind Goldie. Goldie thought about it a moment. She was so scared of making noise. Even the thought of walking to the wall behind her to get the key sounded risky. But opening random doors praying to find the kitchen sounded scary too. And as terrible as it sounded, if the child led the way and walked into a room with the house's owners, the child might keep the owner busy long enough for her to get away. As she unlocked the cage, she gave the child a warning. "Remember, we have to be quiet and go straight to the kitchen so I can use the phone." The child gave a nod, grateful to be let out. And together they began their cautious trek deeper into the mysterious house. Goldie followed closely behind the child, their tiny footsteps surprisingly assertive against the wooden floorboards as they made their way through the dim corridors. Goldie's eyes were drawn to the walls. Large, erratic scratches and gashes marred the otherwise pristine woodwork. It looked as if a wild animal had tried to claw its way through. What was this place? The child led her to a set of double doors, pushing them open to reveal the kitchen. Immediately, Goldie's senses were assaulted by a horrible odor. It was a mixture of stale air and something rotten. At the center of the room was a large wooden table, lit by a few randomly placed candles. Various dishes and plates were spread out, but the source of the smell was evident, a pot of meat stew that sat in the middle of the entire thing. Without hesitation, the child made a beeline for the table, quickly scooping up a spoonful of the stew and gulping it down. Goldie watched in horror and slight disgust. The meat, illuminated by the flickering candles, looked undercooked, and its origin was questionable. "Wait," Goldie whispered sharply, pointing to the old rotary phone on the wall. "Just let me make the call first, and then we can get you some good food." The child paused, locking eyes with Goldie. "But I'm so hungry," they whimpered, their small voice filled with desperation. Goldie approached the phone and picked it up, trying to be as quiet as possible. She felt her heart sink. The line was dead. Tracing the cord to the wall, she found it had been chewed through. Panic settled in, knowing their one hope of contacting the outside world was now gone. Distracted by her discovery, she missed the child's attempt to reach another plate of food. A loud screech filled the room as the child's fingers met the scalding hot contents of a dish at the head of the table. The plate was hastily pushed away, its contents spilling on the floor, and the plate shattering. The sudden noise echoed through the house, and almost instantly a series of heavy thuds echoed from above. The child's face went pale. "Oh no," he murmured, his voice trembling. "We woke up Grandpa! He's more dangerous at night! We need to hide downstairs!" Goldie barely had time to react as the child's hand wrapped around her own, pulling her away from the kitchen into a door in the hall that she'd noticed before but assumed was a closet. As soon as they were behind the door, she realized it was not a closet. It was the entrance to the cellar. In the darkness, she could feel the child pulling her down. Goldie instinctively pulled out her cell phone, turning on its flashlight. The dim light revealed a narrow wooden staircase that the child was trying to get her down with all of his might. He clearly was familiar with the cellar. All at once he let go and went down the stairs in the dark. Echoes and reverberations from Grandpa's movement could still be felt throughout the house. Goldie began her cautious descent. Upon reaching the bottom, the flashlight revealed what you'd expect in a cellar. There were some dusty boxes, old trunks, cobwebs stretching between forgotten storage items. But just a little beyond the steps, things were far from ordinary. The room expanded into a larger space, the walls made of cold, wet stone, reminiscent of ancient dungeons from old stories. The defining feature of this room was what looked like an old prison cell, its thick bars going from wall to wall, intense dark metal that seemed to absorb the light. The child ran around the room lighting candles, allowing Goldie to eventually see it all at once. Behind the bars, to Goldie's horror, were the remnants of what looked like a child's life. There were toys scattered across the floor, a small, well-worn bed, and a pile of old dirty blankets in the corner. Her mind raced as she tried to piece together the story of this hidden prison. Why was it here? Was it for this child? However, before she could think any further, the child ran straight towards the cage. It was like he was compelled, driven by some unknown force to get inside. He began trying to pull the heavy metal barred door closed. Goldie stepped forward. "Wait, what are you doing?" she whispered in her trembling voice. The child looked up, his eyes wide with fear. "It's safest here," he replied, his voice quivering. "When the bells ring, it's the most dangerous time. We have to stay here till morning." Goldie grabbed him and tried to pull him out of the cage, but suddenly the boy's demeanor changed. Panic took over, and he lashed out at her, biting her hand with a surprising strength. Goldie, shocked and in pain, released her grip, and the child retreated further into the depths of the cage, hiding beneath the small bed. His breathing was rapid and shallow. Every exhale sounded like a plea for help. Goldie nursed her bitten hand. Her heart raced, every beat echoing the mounting dread inside of her. A bone-chilling roar resonated through the house, a terrifying mix of raw power and anger. As the reverberation subsided, 2 more roars answered from the distance outside, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy lumbering footsteps rushing towards the house. Goldie, paralyzed with fear, looked up at the ceiling. She could hear the sound of the front door being pounded. With every blow, the cellar ceiling would shake like it was made of cardboard. This continued until Goldie heard a loud crack. It was the sharp noise of the front door shattering, sending splinters and echoes in all directions. Goldie's gaze darted around, searching for a way out, a safe spot. But the scratching and pounding at the cellar door confirmed her fears. They were cornered. In a desperate move, Goldie bolted to the prison cell and closed the heavy metal door. The child continued to hide under the small bed. There wasn't much space in the prison cell, but the thick bars were her only protection from the monstrosities. Goldie tried to focus on what the child had said. They'd be safe in the morning, but the ringing bells were dangerous. What ringing bells? Was there a church somewhere? Maybe an alarm of some sort. Then, her thoughts, the child's screams, and the banging against the door were all interrupted by the melodious chime of a grandfather clock. It was the bells the child had mentioned. Goldie was sure of it, because after the child had heard the bells, he began screaming even louder. As if on cue, another deafening roar tore through the room, followed by the sound of the cellar door being violently thrust open. Goldie's heart pounded even harder, her breaths coming in short gasps. With no other option, she grabbed the collection of dirty old blankets and draped them over herself, huddling in the corner, desperately praying she'd remain unseen. From her makeshift hiding spot, she peeked through a tiny gap in the blankets. 2 monstrous figures stormed down the steps. They looked like bears, but their jaws were wider, and their teeth looked more monstrous. Their hulking bodies cast immense shadows across the room. Goldie could feel herself completely vibrating in fear, as she watched the two creatures clawing and slamming against the cage's bars, each blow causing the metal to resonate with a hollow clang. But the bars and stone held firm. Then the two creatures stopped completely. The boy continued screaming. But upstairs, movement could be heard again. Something was coming to the cellar. Goldie watched in terror as a third figure emerged from the staircase. It was bigger, its fur grayer, its muscles more pronounced. Its eyes looked like they held an evil secret. The two moved aside, seeming to respect the larger monstrosity. The child's warning echoed in Goldie's mind. Grandpa. It was the elder of the beast, and clearly the alpha. Goldie held her breath, hoping the blankets would shield her from their eyes and noses. She clutched them tighter, feeling the cold stone of the wall against her back. The alpha took several swings at the cage with its massive claws, but the bars held strong. Having a little confidence in the bars, Goldie began to breathe a little. She shifted the blankets to see what was going on with the child under the bed, who was still screaming. But what she saw was not the innocent child she met earlier. In the dim light, she could see him convulsing violently. His small frame began to enlarge and distort. Bones cracked and reshaped, fur quickly covered his body, and his screams became guttural growls. Before her very eyes, the child was transforming into a creature eerily similar to those outside of the cell. A werebear. She watched horrified as the metamorphosis completed. The once familiar face of the boy was now completely gone, replaced by the face of a young, but equally ferocious monster. The final chime of the clock signified the end of the transformation. With his instincts driven by newfound hunger and the primal urges of his monstrous form, the child-turned-werebear turned its attention to Goldie. In one swift motion, the creature lunged at Goldie. The blankets offered little resistance, and her terrified screams mixed with the triumphant roars of the werebears outside. The horror she felt was now overshadowed by the brutal reality of the cruel twist of fate that led her to this end.
Phew! Wasn't that a hair-raising ride, my fiendish friends? Ha! Now, before you scamper off into the night, I want to remind you, this year's Super Horror Calendar's theme is going to be dark fairy tales. On the screen now is Pinocchio and the nightmarish Pied Piper of Hamelin. There should be an official announcement next week, so keep your eyes and ears out for them. You're gonna need a calendar anyways, so you might as well get one that's awesome. Sadly, Goldilocks did not make this year's calendar. To be fair, this story was crazy enough. I'm pretty sure she bit off more than she could chew. Get it? More than she could chew?
This happened a few years ago, before everyone had GPS on their phones. You would buy these standalone GPS units and plug them into your car's cigarette lighter. Anyways, I was on a long solo drive, making my way to visit some family. I'd never made the drive before, so I heavily relied on my GPS. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, the GPS instructed, "In 2 miles, take a left turn." Following its direction, I found myself on a seemingly unused dirt road. The dense trees on either side made it feel more like a tunnel. Their long branches were almost like reaching out for the car. My gut told me to turn around, but the GPS confidently announced, "Continue straight for 10 miles. So I did. The road did eventually open up to reveal an old sign. "Welcome to Harrowsville." An unease settled in my stomach as I drove through what appeared to be a long abandoned town. The buildings were decrepit, windows shattered, and streets overrun with trash. It was as if time had frozen, and the town's residents had vanished without a trace. Suddenly the GPS chirped, "You have arrived at your destination." Confused, I stopped the car and looked around. Maybe one of these buildings used to be a hotel, but they certainly weren't a hotel now. As I peered into a storefront, I noticed something moving. It was a person. or at least it had the shape of a person. Kind of stumbled around a little. It could have been a drunk, or a homeless person, or maybe a looter that was injured. I was about to shout out if they wanted a ride to civilization, but then I noticed more of these stumbling people moving around the inside of the building. I'd seen enough. This couldn't be right. I was supposed to be staying at a hotel on the main highway, not in some freak ghost town. Without a second thought, I slammed the gas and sped out of Harrowsville. I fidgeted with the GPS and had it direct me to one of those gas station truck stops. I didn't want to risk being alone. When I reached it, I finally felt like I could breathe. I bought a bottle of water and a sandwich, but I didn't want to leave the store and risk being alone, or worse. What if one of the people in that building followed me here? So I opened the sandwich and started eating it inside. The cashier was not happy with me. I think he thought I was on drugs because I was shaking so much. I told him it wasn't anything like that I somehow got detoured into a freak show of a town, Harrowsville. The cashier turned white as a ghost. He said that I should not have been able to get to Harrowsville, that it had been abandoned for decades after a mysterious event left its population missing. According to the cashier, it's been the subject of countless urban legends. Everyone said my brother and I were just imagining things, but it seems so unlikely now. Before the internet, when you saw something strange, you just assumed you were crazy. Now you can reach out, and other people that have experienced the same thing can digitally nod in agreement. The first thing I noticed that morning was the absurdity of the scene outside of my bedroom window. A fully formed snowman stood in our backyard, its round shape and carrot nose standing strong in the July sun. I ran downstairs, thinking this must be some sort of joke. My younger brother, Tom, would often do dumb things like this. He enjoyed trying to trick people into believing dumb things, like he found a dinosaur footprint. I assumed this was his latest prank, but he seemed just as baffled as I was. We both stepped outside, the summer heat hitting our skin. Yet inexplicably, it was cold near the snowman. I reached out to touch its icy surface. It felt as real as any snowman I'd built during the winter. "This can't be happening," Tom murmured. We stood outside for a little bit and noticed other strange things. Birds avoided flying over our house, and the neighbor's cat, usually found lounging in our garden, was nowhere to be seen. But the weirdest thing was the snowman. It felt cold, wasn't melting. It was just there. Tom and I decided to go eat breakfast. We figured afterwards we'd go back out with some matches to see if we could force the snowman to melt away. But when we got back, it was gone. No puddle either. Just gone. Hey everyone, before we wrap up, I wanted to let you all know that I almost didn't feature the Summertime Snowman on Shadow Puppet Horror Theater, but I was drawn to how eerie it was and began wondering if it was some sort of time slip or a glitch in the Matrix. I'm curious what you guys think. Leave your theories in the comments below. I read every one of them. And as always, thanks for watching. In the quiet town of Kyoto, an old railway track has been long abandoned, overtaken by weeds and rust. However, the locals rarely venture near it, especially after sundown, for the track has been said to be haunted by the ghost of Teki Teki. Mai, a curious high school student, didn't believe in such tales. One evening, while returning from her friend's house, she took a shortcut home, which cut right through the forsaken track. As she walked, she recalled the old stories of Teki Teki. Some say she was a girl who tragically fell onto the tracks. Others say she was pushed. No matter the beginning, the end is the same for both stories. Her body was severed by a train, and now roamed the area, seeking revenge. Mai chuckled to herself, dismissing the tales as mere stories to scare children. Suddenly, a chilling wind blew, and Mai began to hear the faint sound of something scraping in the distance. Techie, techie. Techie, techie. Techie, techie. The sound grew louder and closer. Panic rose in Mai's chest. She turned to see a ghostly sight, the upper torso of a girl dragging herself rapidly towards Mai with her clawed, raw hands and her face twisted in rage. Mai's heart raced. She ran as fast as she could, the sound of Teki Teki's dragging and scraping echoing in her ears. Reaching the end of the tracks, Mai stumbled upon an old, decrepit train station. Hoping she could hide there, she quickly dashed into the station's waiting room and closed the door behind her. Gasping for breath, she leaned against the door, listening intently. The scraping sound grew fainter until it vanished completely. Relieved, Mai tried to regain her composure. She quietly smiled, thinking to herself about how silly she looked. There's no such thing as train ghost. Looking around the dimly lit room, old newspaper clippings were strewn across the floor. She glanced at one and immediately began to hyperventilate. To her horror, they detailed the tragic accident of the girl on the tracks, but what caught her attention was a picture of the group of high school students laughing. The girl in the center of the group looked like the ghost she had just seen. If you enjoyed this, check out our Shadow Puppet Horror Theater playlist. There's more urban legends coming soon. Jasmine was an only child. It was lonely at times, but it did allow her parents to spoil her with little gifts here and there. She laid in her bed, the quiet hum of the night surrounding her. The glow of her pink nightlight added an element of happiness and femininity to all of her toys and dolls. Everything was as it should be, until she noticed a faint whisper coming from her closet. Psst! Jasmine! Come here! It beckoned. She froze. It sounded exactly like her own voice, a perfect mimicry. But how could that be possible? Jasmine, can you hear me? Why are you scared? The voice continued. It's just me. I'm just you. Jasmine's heart raced. Who are you, and why do you sound like me? I told you. We're the same, the voice insisted. Its tone gentle, yet eerie. Come join me in the closet. Let's play together. Jasmine did not want to reveal how terrified she was. She calmly replied, But my toys are all out here. Why don't you come out here and play? The voice hesitated. I can't. It's against the rules. But once you join me in the closet, you'll understand everything. Jasmine, still terrified, sat on her bed silently. I have Charlie here. The closet voice spoke up again. Charlie was Jasmine's toy puppy dog. She would play with him all the time, until one day he got lost. Jasmine looked over at the slightly open closet door, and could just make out Charlie creeping out from behind some boxes. Now she was really confused. Using whatever courage she had, she got up from her bed and carefully began to approach the closet door, her hand reaching for the knob. But before opening it all the way, she paused, listening intently. The whispers had stopped. So she shut the door. That night, Jasmine couldn't fall asleep. When her mom came into her room the next morning, she told her what happened. Her mom assured her it was all just a bad dream, and even went as far as to dig in her closet to prove nothing was there. Jasmine never heard the voice again, but she never forgot the night her own voice called her from the closet. Deep in the woods of New York, there's a special place called Sleepy Hollow. It's a quiet village that seems like it's filled with magic and mystery
The tall trees there seem to whisper old stories, if you're listening closely. The rivers shine and sparkle, and some say they hold secrets from long ago. As the day turns to night, the sky becomes a mix of orange and purple, making the village look even more magical. Many of the people of Sleepy Hollow are the descendants of the original settlers, and they love sharing their tales. During the day, Sleepy Hollow runs like any other town, as the people go about, engaging in their farming and trading. But when night comes, and a cool mist covers the village, everyone gathers around warm fires. The older members of the town tell stories that have been shared for many, many years. Everyone listens closely, especially when they're telling stories about the Headless Horseman. They say he's a ghostly rider that lost his head in a battle, and now he rides around the village at night. The children, wide open eyes, imagine every detail, while the grown-ups nod, remembering the times they heard the stories as children. Every time someone mentions the Headless Horseman, a quiet feeling falls upon the people. It's like everyone remembers just how mysterious and special Sleepy Hollow really is. In the heart of Sleepy Hollow lived a man named Ichabod Crane. Now, Ichabod wasn't like everyone else. He was tall and skinny with long arms and legs that reminded some of a spider. His nose was long, kind of like a bird's beak, which gave him a curious look, but his eyes were always wide and alert, perfectly matched to how he loved to learn and discover new things. Ichabod's family was not from Sleepy Hollow. He came from Connecticut to be the school teacher. He taught the kids in a small schoolhouse where the sounds of lessons and laughter could be heard. But teaching wasn't his only talent. He was also in charge of the village choir, leading people in song with his strong and clear voice. After school, Ichabod loved visiting the homes of his students, especially if they invited him over for dinner. Ichabod had a hearty appetite. He could eat more than anyone would guess by looking at his thin frame. And oh, how he loved the tasty dishes the villagers cooked. It wasn't unusual for him to stay a little longer at homes where he knew big, delicious meals awaited him. But there was another reason Ichabod loved to visit the villagers. He was absolutely fascinated by ghost stories. He'd sit with the elderly people, listening closely as they told tales of spirits and strange happenings in Sleepy Hollow. Each story would make his eyes grow wider, and even though he'd sometimes shiver in fear, he just could not resist hearing more. Ichabod had dreams too. He often imagined living a life of comfort with plenty of food and not a worry in the world. And as days turned to months in Sleepy Hollow, his dreams began to take a new shape, all because of a certain young lady in the village, Katrina Van Tassel. Katrina was the kind of girl that could make anyone's head turn. She had rosy cheeks, bright eyes, and a laugh that was as cheerful as a songbird's tune. But it wasn't just her beauty that caught Ichabod's attention. Katrina was also the only child of the wealthy farmer, Baltus Van Tassel. The more he got to know Katrina, the more Ichabod would daydream. He imagined a life where he married Katrina and became the master of Van Tassel Farm. He saw himself sitting by a grand fireplace, feasting on delicious pies and roasted meats every day. The thought of being wealthy, respected, and married to the most beautiful girl in town sounded like paradise to Ichabod. But Ichabod wasn't the only one who had his eyes on Katrina. There was another man, a strong, boisterous fellow named Abraham Van Brunt. But everyone called him Brom Bones. Brom was the exact opposite of Ichabod. He was broad, muscular, and loved playing pranks on people just for fun. And Brom, too, wanted to win Katrina's heart. This began a silent battle between Ichabod and Brom. While Ichabod tried to impress Katrina with his singing and education, Brom tried to woo her with his strength and daring deeds. The village was abuzz with talk about the love triangle, with everyone curious to see who Katrina would choose. However, Brom, being the prankster that he was, didn't wait around. He started playing tricks on Ichabod, hoping to scare him away from Sleepy Hollow and Katrina. From time to time, he'd make eerie noises outside of Ichabod's home.
or imitate ghostly whispers. Brom did all he could to frighten the superstitious schoolteacher. Life in Sleepy Hollow became even more interesting as the villagers watched this game of cat and mouse unfold. One day there was an announcement that brought great excitement to the residents of Sleepy Hollow. The Van Tassels were hosting a grand autumn party at their sprawling farm. Invitations went out, and soon the entire village was buzzing with anticipation. It was the perfect occasion for Ichabod to make his feelings known to Katrina, and for Brom to showcase his bravado. The night of the party was clear, with a million stars twinkling above. The Van Tassel home was alight with lanterns and candles casting warm glows everywhere. Music, laughter, and the scent of delicious food filled the air. Ichabod made sure to look his best. He danced with Katrina, and for a moment he felt that she might actually be interested in him. The glances she gave him, the slight touch of her hand, it all made his heart race. Brom, not to be outdone, began telling the crowd stories of his bravery and strength. He played the fiddle, giving everyone a lively tune to dance to. But whenever he saw Katrina and Ichabod together, a jealous expression flashed upon his face. As the night wore on, the gathering began to share ghost stories. The tale of the Headless Horseman was, of course, the highlight. Ichabod listened, paying close attention, his imagination painting every detail. Brom, sensing an opportunity, embellished his own encounter with the phantom, making it sound even more terrifying. When it was finally time to leave, Ichabod felt a mix of hope and fear. Hope, because he believed he had made an impression on Katrina, and fear, due to the haunting tales that still echoed in his ears. As he rode through the woods, the sounds of the night seemed louder, the shadows more menacing. The tales of the Headless Horseman replayed in his mind, making every rustle and gust of wind feel like a lurking danger. Ichabod's horse, Gunpowder, seemed to sense his rider's unease. Every now and then the old borrowed horse would twitch its ears or give a nervous snort, which only heightened Ichabod's anxiety. The path through the woods, which was familiar to him by day, now felt like an entirely different world, with its dark nooks and echoing sounds. A sudden burst of wind made the tree sway and whisper. Ichabod remembered the tales the old ladies told, of spirits and ghosts that roamed Sleepy Hollow, especially on nights like this one. He hummed a tune to himself, trying to keep his rising fear at bay. But then he heard it, a sound that wasn't just the wind, or a rustling animal. It was the distant thud of hooves. They grew louder and more rhythmic, indicating a horse galloping at a steady pace. Ichabod urged Gunpowder to go faster, hoping to avoid whoever or whatever was behind him. A glance over his shoulder revealed a silhouette. It was a large, dark figure on a horse, and most chillingly, it seemed to be missing its head. A panic gripped Ichabod as he realized this might be the very Headless Horseman the villagers spoke of. He recalled from the old tales that the ghostly rider could not cross the bridge near the church. If he could just make it there, he'd be safe. Pushing his fear aside, Ichabod spurred Gunpowder on, racing to the bridge, with the relentless gallop of the Headless Horseman echoing in his ears. The trees seemed to blur past as Ichabod clung tightly to Gunpowder, urging the old horse to muster all of its strength. The wind howled in his ears, and the thudding hooves of the Headless Horseman grew louder, each beat echoing Ichabod's racing heart. As he neared the bridge, the moonlight revealed its worn-out planks and the shimmering waters beneath. The church's silhouette stood on the other side, offering a beacon of hope. With one last push, Ichabod steered Gunpowder onto the bridge, the wooden boards clattering under the horse's hooves. Behind him, the Headless Horseman's steed thundered onto the bridge, its rider letting out a chilling, otherworldly scream. Just as Ichabod began to believe he might escape, the Headless Horseman threw a head-shaped pumpkin at Ichabod. Morning, the villagers discovered Ichabod's hat by the broken pumpkin, and nearby, the trampled ground suggested a fierce chase. But of Ichabod Crane, there was no sign. He had vanished, leaving behind only whispers and speculations. Some said he'd been taken by the horsemen, while others believed he moved to a distant town, too terrified to return. A few claimed to have seen him in other places, alive, but forever changed by that haunted night. Brom Bones, who shortly after the incident married Katrina, would often chuckle whenever the story was mentioned. There was a gleam in his eye that made the villagers wonder if he knew a little more than he let on. In the end, what truly happened to Ichabod Crane remains one of Sleepy Hollow's most enduring mysteries. Abraham Lincoln, known to many as one of America's greatest presidents, is celebrated for his leadership during one of America's most turbulent times, but recently discovered documents hint at a secret chapter in his life. Hidden among old government archives was a curious account. It suggests that, much like today, there were concerns about some corrupt individuals in the government. But this wasn't about money. According to the documents, there were vampires within the Capitol. Lincoln, taking his oath to protect the people from all threats, seen and unseen, held a covert meeting at midnight. At the meeting, he spoke at great length about problems facing the country, but the meeting was just a ruse. Abraham Lincoln managed to speak until dawn. That's when he revealed his true objective: to expose the alleged supernatural beings by having everyone in attendance, one by one, stand in the first light of day. Everyone thought this was some sort of strange joke. Lincoln was known to be a little odd, but when Lincoln insisted, 2 attendees allegedly revealed their true vampiric nature and attacked the president. Lincoln was prepared to defend himself and quickly pulled out a Bible and a stake. The crowd of politicians was stunned and horrified as they watched Lincoln duel the 2 vampires. Another politician threw a Bible at one of the vampires, causing it to scream out in pain. The small distraction is exactly what Lincoln needed. Lincoln positioned the Bible as a shield to defend himself from the other vampire and staked the first one. The other vampire launched a table at Lincoln, striking him. It was at this point the other attendees rushed to Lincoln's aid, staking the other vampire. Lincoln's injuries from this encounter were downplayed to his wife and to the public to prevent a panic. While the confrontation was intense and Lincoln's bravery undeniable, the chaos that ensued provided the perfect cover for some. Rumors persisted that not all the vampires were exposed that morning. With everyone paying attention to an injured Lincoln, a few vampires may have found ways to shield themselves from the piercing rays of the sun and discreetly slipped away. In the years that followed, occasional mysterious events and unexplained disappearances in the Capitol stoked these speculations. While the tale of that night became the stuff of whispered legends, the watchful eyes of those in the know continued to scan the halls of power, wondering if, and when, the shadows might rise again.
In the bustling heart of London, within the confines of an art studio filled with the scent of fresh paint and bathed in a soft, natural light, Basil Hallward was immersed in his work. With each brushstroke, he brought to life the visage of a young man whose features were as striking as they were innocent. Dorian Gray. Basil, a man of subtlety and grace, found himself deeply proud of his portrait. To him, it wasn't merely a collection of paints on a canvas. It was a reflection of Dorian's pure essence, his unspoiled youth and radiant beauty. But, as with many tales of intrigue, another figure lurked on the horizon, one who would have a profound influence over young Dorian's life. Lord Henry Wotton, a close acquaintance of Basil's, was the antithesis of the reserved painter. He was flamboyant, with a sharp wit and a piercing gaze. Lord Henry was renowned for his unorthodox views on existence. Dorian Gray and Lord Henry's worlds collided that day amidst Basil's brushes and canvases. As Dorian and Lord Henry conversed, the latter imparted his hedonistic worldview upon the young man, emphasizing the unmatched value of youth and the relentless pursuit of pleasure. Captivated, Dorian was introduced to a life where beauty and youth reigned supreme, and where consequences were an afterthought. Later, With Lord Henry's seductive words still echoing in his ears, Dorian found himself gazing intently at his almost completed portrait. It wasn't just the likeness that astounded him, but the youth and the vitality it radiated. A creeping sadness took hold as he considered the inevitable. While the portrait would forever capture this moment of his youth, he himself would fall prey to the sands of time. Emotion swirling, Dorian, influenced by Lord Henry's philosophy, made a whimsical but heartfelt wish. I wish that I could remain as young as the man in this painting, and let the painting bear the weight of my years instead. He sighed aloud, lost in the moment. Days turned to weeks, and Lord Henry's influence on Dorian became more evident. The once young innocent man was now frequently found in the company of the flamboyant lord, hanging on to his every word. London's grand ballrooms, theaters, and private clubs became their playgrounds. Lord Henry introduced Dorian to a world of luxury and decadence, where every desire was indulged and every pleasure pursued. Dorian, with his captivating beauty, became the talk of the town. Under Lord Henry's tutelage, he embraced the idea that beauty and youth were life's greatest assets, and he would relish them while they lasted. The consequences of actions mattered less and less to Dorian, and he became increasingly reckless in his pursuits. Amidst this whirlwind, Dorian's heart was ensnared by the enchanting Sybil Vane, a beautiful young actress. Watching her perform on stage, he was smitten by her talent and innocence. The two quickly fell in love, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though Dorian had found true happiness. However, love's illusion was shattered one night when Dorian excitedly took Lord Henry and Basil to watch Sybil perform. But that evening, whether it was nerves or fate, Sybil's performance was lackluster. Dorian, influenced by Lord Henry's ideals of perfection, felt embarrassed and let down. In a fit of rage and disappointment, he confronted Sybil, cruelly rejecting her love and questioning her talent. Heartbroken and devastated by Dorian's harsh words, Sybil found herself lost in a whirlwind of emotions and took her own life. Dorian, for all of his outward composure, felt the weight of his actions, but it wasn't until he had revisited the portrait that the true impact of his behavior became clear. Where once the image had reflected his youthful innocence, it now bore a hint of cruelty. The once vibrant eyes now held a cold, disdainful glint. This subtle transformation in the painting sent chills down Dorian's spine. It was evident that his whimsical wish that day had come true. The portrait was now a mirror, not of his outward appearance, but of his soul. With every misdeed, every act of cruelty or selfishness, the image would transform, bearing the scars of his actions, while he remained untouched by the hands of time and consequence. As the realization dawned, Dorian felt both horror and fascination. The painting had become both a blessing and a curse, a silent witness to the darkness that was slowly enveloping his soul. Disturbed and fearful that others might see its grotesque changes, Dorian decided to hide it away. The painting was moved from its proud place in his home to a locked attic room, far from prying eyes. This secluded chamber became Dorian's dark sanctuary, a place where he could confront the truth of his actions without judgment. Dorian, with his newfound secret, delved deeper into the world of decadence and vice. Lord Henry's hedonistic teachings became his guiding principles, pushing him to explore every indulgence and vice that London's shadowy corners had to offer. With each passing day, he tasted new pleasures, leaving no desire unexplored. Yet, while the world marveled at Dorian's seemingly eternal youth and beauty, the portrait bore the brunt of his excesses. It became a grotesque record of his life, each sin etching its mark onto the canvas. What began as a mere sneer intensified into a monstrous visage. The skin on the painting grew sallow, his eyes bloodshot, and his expression twisted into one of malevolence and cruelty. The contrast between Dorian's outer beauty and the hideousness of the portrait grew more pronounced. It was a perverse game. With every new misdeed, Dorian would visit the locked room to absorb the transformation in the painting. Sometimes he would recoil in horror. Other times he would gaze with a morbid fascination. Bit by bit, the portrait transformed into a grotesque mockery of Dorian's former self.
a haunting testament to the depths of his corruption. The years rolled on, but time seemed to stand still for Dorian. London society was abuzz with whispers. How could a man remain so untouched by age? Some said he'd found the elixir of youth, while others whispered of dark dealings and unholy pacts. Every lavish party he attended, every theater outing or ball, eyes would follow him, some with envy, others with suspicion. To divert attention and to stave off the ever-growing speculation, Dorian would often leave London for extended periods of time. These trips were attempts to mask the unsettling reality of his unchanging appearance. His prolonged absences, however, only fueled the intrigue. Tales of his indulgent escapades and the mysterious charm that seemed to repel age became the stuff of hushed conversations in drawing rooms and at dinner parties. But it wasn't just his appearance that was the subject of murmurs. The once golden boy of society, with every passing year, became more associated with whispered tales of debauchery and wickedness. Those who once adored him began to keep their distance, and the name Dorian Gray became synonymous with unspeakable secrets and forbidden allure. The older generation, who remembered a young Dorian, were particularly puzzled. They aged, their hair grayed, and their skin wrinkled. But Dorian, he was as radiant as the day they first met. It was uncanny, unsettling. Young men and women introduced to him would often remark, "My parents or even my grandparents spoke of a Dorian Gray that they knew in their youth, and yet, here you stand, as if a day hasn't passed." Basil grew increasingly concerned. The painter, once so proud of capturing Dorian's essence on canvas, had also heard whispers of his former muse's questionable escapades. With the mounting stories of debauchery and the mysterious unchanging visage of Dorian, Basil's curiosity transformed into genuine worry. One evening, under the cloak of darkness, Basil decided to confront Dorian. He arrived at Dorian's mansion, its looming architecture shadowed by the tales that now surrounded its owner. The mansion seemed more grandiose than he remembered, yet darker, more enigmatic. After a brief exchange with the servant, he was led to Dorian's lavish drawing room. Dorian greeted Basil, feigning surprise and acting cordially. But there was an underlying tension. The two, once close, were now worlds apart. Basil began tentatively addressing the rumors, expressing his concern about Dorian's well-being, and trying to rekindle the connection they once shared. But Dorian, perhaps out of defiance or a twisted sense of trust, decided to reveal the truth to Basil, leading him to the locked attic room. He unveiled the ghostly portrait that had once been the symbol of Dorian's radiant youth. The sight that met Basil's eyes was horrifying. The painting was monstrous, a grotesque representation of the accumulated sins and excesses of Dorian's life. He recoiled in horror. "Is this what you've become, Dorian?" he whispered, tears in his eyes. The once beautiful portrait, his masterpiece, was now a hideous caricature. The weight of his own part in this wicked transformation overwhelmed him. In the dimly lit room, Dorian's face, still as youthful and beautiful as ever, contorted with rage and emotion. "This is your doing, Basil," he spat venomously. "You painted this wretched thing that's taken my life hostage." Basil, in his heartbreak and shock, tried to reason with Dorian. He implored him to seek redemption, to distance himself from the hedonistic path he'd chosen, and find a way to heal his soul. But Dorian, consumed by anger and the revelation of his dark secret, was beyond reason. In the heat of the moment, a fierce argument ensued. Dorian, unable to bear the weight of his sins and the accusations of his once dearest friend, grabbed a nearby knife, and in a fit of uncontrolled rage, he plunged it into Basil, silencing the painter's pleas forever. The room, already heavy with the weight of Dorian's monstrous portrait, now bore witness to an even graver sin. Basil's lifeless body lay at the feet of the very image that had bound his and Dorian's fate together. Dorian, still reeling from the gruesome act he'd just committed, was paralyzed by a mix of horror and desperation. He knew he couldn't handle this situation alone. His mind raced, seeking someone with expertise to help him. It landed on Alan Campbell. Alan was a brilliant scientist who had once admired and respected Dorian. However, Dorian's hedonistic descent had soured their relationship. Despite the rift between them, Dorian felt that Alan was his only hope. He sent a hurried message, appealing to their past friendship, begging Alan to come to his aid. When Alan arrived and beheld the horrifying scene, he was appalled. His first instinct was to turn away, to sever all ties with this monstrous version of the Dorian he had once known. But Dorian, in a mix of charm, desperation, and subtle threats, managed to coerce Alan into helping. Drawing upon his knowledge of chemistry, Alan concocted a method to dissolve Basil's body, ensuring that no trace of the crime remained. But the act of erasing Basil's physical existence could not wipe away the guilt and horror that gnawed at Dorian's soul. If anything, it deepened. The weight of his actions, rather than causing him to seek redemption, pushed him further into the abyss of moral decay. The society that once adored him began to notice not just the mystery of his agelessness, but also the dark aura that surrounded him. Whispers turned louder, speculations more sinister. Still, Dorian's charm and wealth shielded him from outright accusations. His nights became a blur of opium dens, illicit affairs, and even more dangerous liaisons. The portrait, hidden away in the attic, became more grotesque with every passing day, bearing the weight of Dorian's mounting sins. Each morning, after nights of excess, Dorian would find himself drawn to the portrait, a macabre ritual of confronting the depths of his degradation. With every new scar, wrinkle, and every twisted expression that appeared on the canvas, Dorian felt both a revulsion and a perverse thrill. His heart grew colder, and his actions were more ruthless. Friends and acquaintances who once held him in high regard now spoke of him in hushed tones, warning others to keep their distance. Dorian Gray, once the toast of London society, had become its most notorious pariah. The dazzling allure of his youth and beauty was now overshadowed by the tales of his wickedness. The downward spiral seemed endless, with no salvation in sight. The weight of his misdeeds began to suffocate Dorian. Every room he entered, every street he walked, felt like it echoed with the whispers of his dark deeds. He would catch glimpses of disdain, fear, and judgment in the eyes of all those who once adored him. The relentless torment from his conscience, combined with the external whispers, became unbearable. In a desperate attempt to reclaim some semblance of his lost soul, Dorian resolved to chart a new course, one of redemption and benevolence. He began by donating large sums to charities, helping the downtrodden, and investing in the city's deprived areas. Dorian even reconciled with some of those he had wronged in the past, seeking their forgiveness and offering reparations. London society, ever hungry for more tales of transformation and scandal, began to murmur about Dorian's newfound philanthropy. However, behind closed doors, Dorian's true motivation was evident. Each time he performed a good deed, he would rush to the attic, hoping to find some alleviation in the portrait's grotesque features. But to his dismay, the image remained as monstrous as ever. The twisted face stared back, its cruelty and evil undiminished. Confounded and frustrated, it became painfully evident to Dorian that the portrait was not merely a record of his sinful acts, but also of the tainted essence of his soul, making his recent acts of charity and goodwill tainted by selfish motivations to alter the painting and alleviate his own guilt. The portrait, with its unchanging hideousness, was exposing Dorian's own hypocrisy. His attempts at redemption, rather than being genuine, were just another layer of deceit. This realization plunged Dorian deeper into despair. The very fabric of his existence seemed woven with insincerity and vice. The painting, his constant reminder, felt like an unyielding judge, always condemning, never forgiving. As the walls of his grand mansion felt more and more like a prison, Dorian's desperation grew, searching for a way to escape the torment of his dual existence. One stormy night, with the howling winds echoing Dorian's tumultuous emotions, Dorian found himself once again in the attic. The dim light of the room barely touched the corners of the grand attic, where the accursed portrait resided. Dorian, with heavy breaths and tears streaming down his face, approached the canvas that had haunted him for so long. Every brushstroke told the tales of his misdeeds. Every discoloration a mark of his malevolence. It was more than a mirror. It was the embodiment of the monster he had become. Standing in front of the portrait, the hideous reflection of his soul seemed to sneer at him with malevolent glee, reminding him of every wicked act and deceitful intention. The contrast between his real, youthful appearance and the monstrous image on the canvas became too much for him to bear. "This is the root of all my suffering," he whispered hoarsely, his voice filled with a blend of rage and sorrow. He remembered the young, innocent man he once was. Now, trapped within the confines of the frame, was a face marred by all of the choices he'd made. In a moment of mad desperation, Dorian, grasping the knife he used to kill his friend Basil, plunged it into the canvas. There was a tearing sound as the fabric gave way, destroying the evidence of the vile soul that stared back at him, finally ending the terrible pact that had been made. The morning sun found the mansion eerily silent. Concerned by the lack of activity and events of the previous night, the servants, feeling a sense of foreboding, congregated at the foot of the attic stairs. After what felt like hours of hesitation, they finally mustered the courage to break down the locked door. Upon entering, a chilling scene awaited them. In the center of the room lay a withered and aged corpse, barely recognizable, except for the clothes it wore. It was stabbed in the heart, the very knife that had silenced Basil, still embedded. The years of debauchery, sins, and evil that had been hidden from the world were now laid bare for all to see on Dorian's true form. And yet there was another revelation. Adjacent to this horrific sight hung a portrait, its canvas perfect and untouched. It depicted a young Dorian Gray. The art showed no trace of the years of vice and cruelty. It was a pristine representation of youth and beauty. The mystery of Dorian's dual life would remain a topic of hushed discussions and whispered rumors in London's high society for years to come. But one truth emerged clear. In his attempt to escape the clutches of time and mortality, Dorian Gray had ultimately become a prisoner of his own making. The portrait now stood as a haunting testament to the perils of unchecked vanity and the inescapable nature of one's true self.